In a world where every step we take is often traced, recorded and remembered, the stories of those who vanish without a trace resonates and strikes a chord with many of us. Today, we're delving into cases that have puzzled investigators and the public for decades. From rural landscapes where individuals disappear from the safety of their own backyards, to unusual circumstances at a ski resort up in the mountains, they're not tales of accidents or misadventure, but of individuals who seem to step into the void, leaving no trace behind at all. Now, before we get into the first disappearance, I want to thank MyHeritage for being the paid partner for today's video. MyHeritage is the leading global service for family history research and DNA testing. If you're into tracing your roots and figuring out where you come from, MyHeritage is a goldmine. Building your family tree is fun and easy, and you might even find new relatives you didn't know existed. That's what happened to me. By adding the names of my relatives to the tree, I came across their great Smart Matches feature. This let me find out new information about my family. During my discovery, I learned that there's an even greater Royal Navy and Merchant Navy presence in my family than I'd realised. This is my great-great-grandfather, William. William lied about his age to join the Royal Navy a year early at the start of World War I. So now, there are people in the family that I didn't know about before that I can go off and research. With MyHeritage, you can also upload your old photos, colorise them, enhance and repair them. You can even animate them and bring them to life if you really want to. Discover your family's past with MyHeritage, where over 19 billion records await your exploration. With just a few clicks, you can unlock the secrets of your ancestry, even if you're starting from scratch. MyHeritage makes it easy to discover new relatives and delve into your ancestors' past. I've had a great time learning about family members that I'd never heard of before, so sign up now for a free 14-day trial and enjoy all of the features that MyHeritage has to offer. Now, let's begin. On the 29th of January 1942, Patricia Connolly, who was 2.5 years old at the time, vanished from her home in the vicinity of Menlo Park. Google Earth is a little misleading here because in 1942, Menlo Park wasn't as built up as it is today, and I believe Highway 280 didn't exist then. The Connolly family actually lived more rurally, closer to the Los Trancos woods. Some of the neighbours who were unfamiliar to the family were the last to see little Patricia at around 4 PM. She was outside on a patch of grass on the street playing with a stray dog that was often in the neighbourhood. This person said that he stopped his car a moment, asked the child her name and where she lived, and told her that she should go home at once. Then he drove on. She was unable to tell him where she lived. Patricia's father was in hospital at the time as he was ill, and her mother was inside the house right next to where she was playing. Shortly after the neighbour saw Patricia, her mother realised that she'd lost track of her and went outside to retrieve her. Only there was no one to retrieve. The girl and the dog were gone. Now thoroughly in panic mode, she made a search of the neighbourhood. She looked around, walked around the house, called out for Patricia, and then raced to alert the authorities. Investigators came down with canines and began looking around. As it so happened, the dog that Patricia had been playing with was named Lucky, which was sadly not true in this instance. But Lucky turned up again out of nowhere at around 4:30 PM. No one had seen where he'd come from, but two carpenters, Robert and John, who were working nearby before he came back, heard what they said was a peculiar wailing sound. They said that it came from the area near the dam where a creek was located. Now I know what you're thinking, and the authorities were solidified on this position too. After hearing of this, investigators thoroughly believed that she'd fallen into the creek and then swept away. This idea was further substantiated when the searchers' Doberman led them down a trail to the same spot near the creek, sniffed the ground and sat down. This finding was repeated 5 times, and the dog led them straight to the creek. If only it was that simple. People flocked to help out, and some Stanford students quickly brought a canoe and some diving gear and started searching the body of water, but they found nothing and were forced out by the cold weather. At this time, temperatures were around freezing, and this search quickly escalated in size and was now becoming an all-nighter. In the meantime, and as the sun began to dip, the weather had worsened and it was now stormy with harsh winds and rain. An all-night search continued today as deputy sheriffs and members of the county fire warden's force grimly dragged the rough, brush-filled creek bottom for the body. In an effort to lower waters in the creek, timbers were placed in the Searsville Lake spillway, raising the lake level 18 inches and temporarily lowering the creek flow. But rains last night and this morning kept the torrent at fairly high levels. Slim hope was held that Patricia might have wandered in another direction and become lost. The timing of the storm was awful, and it was making the creek difficult to search, and saying that hope was hard to come by was correct. Absolutely everyone involved, including the family, believed that she'd fallen in. But day after day, search after search, the creek had nothing to offer. While they patrolled the flooded stream, casting with ropes, tied with hooks, a gangling, floppy, dirty stray pup frolicked about. It was the dog the little girl was last seen playing with. The dog was the only one that knew what happened to Patricia, but some information just cannot be known to us. Now, let's get bizarre. While sheriff's deputies, fire wardens, interested citizens, and the child's parents searched through the night of January 29, and the next day for Patricia, she was actually passing away due to exposure 2.5 miles away. This was theorised by officials today as the result of the finding of the remains yesterday by Henry Haggett while on a cycling and hiking excursion along Portola Road. Just over a hill from deserted picnic tables and within a few hundred yards of where workmen were building a house at the time, Haggett came across a small pile of bones, wisps of hair and clothing. The article was wrong, and it was actually about 4 miles southwest of the university. This is a rough estimation of where she could have been found. We don't have a precise location, only that it was near Portola Road and was in a steep ravine. There are other contenders, but this is the rough guesstimate. Now, let's just think about what's happened for a moment. When Patricia went missing initially, 2 carpenters heard the sound of a dog wailing as if it was in distress. This was coming from the creek area, which means it was probably Lucky, the dog she was playing with, that came back to the neighbourhood soaking wet. Both Lucky and various search dogs took investigators to the creek time and time again over a period of days. At the creek, they sat down and the scent ended. Around 3 months later, her body was found somewhere miles away in a ravine over a 650-foot mountain. I cannot imagine for a moment that Patricia was able to get there by herself. In reconstructing the event, investigating officers said the tiny girl must have wandered the hills until she was exhausted and then simply laid down and passed away. Unless in the reconstruction Patricia was given a helicopter, I don't see how that makes sense here. Not if we're saying a 650-foot climb was in the way. Also, a reconstruction of the event was never mentioned anywhere else, so I don't know if that happened or not. I just can't see her walking all the way there. Now, there is a clue that everyone seems to have completely overlooked somehow. This isn't definite of course, and it is speculation, but through the articles, we know that Lucky hated the water, yet he was found soaking wet, as if he himself had definitely been there at the creek. In fact, he had probably been at that creek with Patricia, as confirmed by all of the search dogs. Since that appears to be the case, an argument could be made that someone came across Patricia and the dog by chance, took her, the dog responded and was pushed into the water, and the 2 carpenters unknowingly actually heard the whole thing go down. That is the only rational, yet highly speculative conclusion that I can draw here. Now, to be fair, this disappearance does have the missing 411 written all over it, and I can already hear the comments on this one, that Patricia may have been exposed to something completely out of the ordinary. What I find fascinating about this whole ordeal was that there weren't any articles, or at least that I could find, that were the least bit skeptical about this. There were just no questions asked about it at all. The conclusions that they drew were that the scent leading to the creek must have been a mistake. Lucky was never mentioned again. The place she was found, and the effort it would take a 2-year-old to get there, wasn't mentioned. It's as if nobody wanted to acknowledge that Patricia might have been taken by someone, even though the idea that she got there alone seems ridiculous. There's an elephant in the room, and everyone was just ignoring it for some reason. Anyway, I've exhausted all of the information I can find on Patricia, so let's turn back the pages to 1924, where I came across another disappearance that I thought was odd and shares some similarities with Patricia, at least a little. In October of 1924, Margaret Turner was 20 months old and lived with both of her parents in the city of Durango in Colorado. Sometime during the day of the 2nd of October that year, Margaret was inside the home with her mother. I believe the mother was just taking care of things inside the house while her husband was out working, but whatever the case may be, it seems that at some point she lost track of Margaret. The family lived a rural life and their home was isolated away from others. It's not known how Margaret left the home, but during the morning, the mother realised that she was gone. She started to search the house, then it became frantic, and then she was in full-blown panic mode trying to find her. She ran outside and around the home, and then called the La Plata County Sheriff's Office, and they responded quickly. The deputies put a call out for help, and members of the community came to their residence and started to search outside. It became clear to all involved that Margaret just simply wasn't in the area anymore. Some believed that she'd been taken by a third party, while others believed that she must have just walked out and away from the home. Most toddlers begin to start walking around the 11 to 16 month mark, so it's possible, I suppose, but I'm not sure how far you'd expect them to be able to get at that age. Now, thankfully, Margaret was found, though not in the way you might expect. Margaret hadn't just been wandering around outside the house, she'd managed to travel over 5 miles west of the point that she disappeared from. Not only that, but she was found on top of a barren peak. This article stated, evidence indicated that 20-month-old Margaret Turner, found on a mountain after a 24-hour search, had been taken by an enemy of her father, John Turner, and left to pass away. The girl will recover. I'm not sure that there was any physical evidence of this at all. I mean, obviously, aside from the fact that little Margaret had managed to get to the top of a mountain, which would have been impossible alone. But this evidence being referred to in the article, I believe, was more of an accusation made by John about someone who I suppose he didn't get on with. The reason I say that can be found in the next article. The child was unharmed when found, and obviously had not spent the night on a frozen mountaintop where she was found, as to have done so would have meant passing away by freezing. Authorities are searching for the motive of the person who took the child from her home and abandoned her on the mountain after sheltering her for the night. No clue to his identity has yet been found. So in other words, they had no motive and no suspect. It's interesting too, because they all realised that Margaret couldn't have survived being left on the mountain overnight as it was simply too cold, and that she must have been kept warm somehow. So, the hypothesis was that someone, for reasons they couldn't ascertain, came to the home, took Margaret in broad daylight, took her to their home, I suppose, didn't harm her or anything like that, then took her out to the top of a mountain and left her there. The circumstances of this case are prime missing 411 territory. This girl, who couldn't have walked 5 miles away and up a mountain, being found completely unharmed on a mountain, it's just weird. John Turner must have reasoned that his enemy, whoever that was, wanted to get at John by harming his family, so took her to the top of a mountain. That's certainly odd, but not out the realm of possibility. Crazy people do exist after all. But the authorities, it seems, had no evidence of this at all. The sheriff, George Rowe, knew how odd this whole ordeal was, and he said this. Being barely able to walk, however, Sheriff Rowe said it would have been impossible for the baby to have scaled the heights where she was found, or to survive the cold of Thursday night without shelter afforded somewhere else. The spot where the baby was found is in high country, sparsely overgrown with scrub oak. Authorities believe that whoever placed the child on top of the peak did so sometime during the day Friday, as passing away from exposure would have been certain if she laid there all of Thursday night. Margaret was probably kept in a shelter Thursday night, and the person took her to the mountain Friday. So, it seems that everyone was in agreement that Margaret couldn't have made it up there alone, though no one understood who or why she was taken up there. As said, she'd been completely unharmed and had no injuries at all. This mountain didn't have dense forestry, but rather had small scrub bushes scattered around, which is likely why she was actually found there. It's not clear why some of the searchers ventured this far out, but thank goodness they did. If a person did leave her up there, which seems risky to do in daylight while there's a search ongoing, perhaps he didn't think the search would reach that far so he wouldn't be seen. Some were speculating that a mountain lion may have taken her up there, but it seems like she would have been in far worse condition being dragged around if that were the case. Anyway, again, much like Patricia, I've exhausted all of the information surrounding this case. What do you think happened to her that day? The next disappearance I wanted to share with you is unlike most that appear on the channel, as this was a case where 3 people all vanished at the same time. In 1948, Albert Snyder was considered one of the most accomplished Canadian jockeys around, but also finding success in the United States. On the 5th of March that year, he found himself on a yacht with John B. Campbell, the Secretary of New York Racing. The yacht in question was the Evelyn K, a 65-foot vessel where a group of people were celebrating as Al had been offered a full-time contract by Calumet Farms the day before. The plan was to go on a fishing trip in the Florida Keys area, and that was exactly what they were doing at the time. At around 5 PM on the 5th, Albert, Trotter and Don Fraser decided to take the 13-foot wooden skiff out around a mile away from the yacht and towards the land into shallow waters. They told those remaining on the yacht that they would be back in just over an hour to enjoy the fish that was being prepared back on board. The yacht and skiff were perfectly visible to each other from this distance, but soon after reaching the shallow waters and having fished for a while, visibility dropped and the sun began its descent. Back on the yacht, Miller, Boyder and Woods said they all saw the flickering reflection of the setting sun glance on Schneider's metal casting rod from the deck of the yacht. 2 minutes later, they vanished into the darkness. Horwood quoted the men as saying the small boat was only 1.5 miles from the yacht when darkness enveloped it. There was no wind or rain. The winds began to rise about 8:30 PM, they said, and reached a peak velocity of about 30 miles an hour at 10:30 PM. No rain fell in the vicinity that night or the next day, they said. Those aboard the yacht became worried about the trio because initially they said they were only going to be an hour, and yet as the sun began to set, which would have been around 6:30 PM, they were still there. I can only imagine that they must have been enjoying themselves at the time. However, this shouldn't have caused too much of an issue because the yacht itself was lit up well enough to be seen from miles away. Though it's not clear why they were still out there over 3 hours later at 8:30 PM. Were they having problems or something? For further context, the spot they were at in the shallow water was said to be so close to the land that not only was it possible to swim the distance, and all 3 were strong swimmers, but it was also possible to stand too, though uncomfortably I'm sure. The skiff that they were on was in excellent condition and was powered by a motor, and had oars too. It had plenty of gasoline and enough life preservers for everyone. Miller said when the sudden darkness enveloped the craft, he turned on the cabin lights, then turned on a revolving searchlight which would have been seen for several miles. Miller said that the lights were operated throughout the night. He said that they didn't begin an immediate search with the yacht because they believed it was best to stay put and use as a marker for the lost fishermen. Miller, Boyder and Woods said that they were at a complete loss to understand what happened in the 2 hours between sunset and the first impact of wind. Everyone on the yacht didn't understand why Al, Trotter and Don were taking so long, especially as it started to get dark. Trotter's son was on board and said, "It was a very unusual storm. It became so dark and it seemed to last about an hour. There was lightning and heavy winds. This storm was sudden and the winds destroyed telephone lines and knocked over a 70-foot elevator tower on a nearby beach." The onlookers on the yacht said that they didn't expect there to be an issue. They said that one moment the waters were clear, they could see the skiff perfectly fine, and then the next they were surrounded by darkness and the lightning started along with the strong winds. I wonder why Al, Trotter and Don didn't turn back when it started to get dark. This could have been completely avoided. They were also in shallow water and could have easily made it back to the land. Even after this unexpected storm began to pick up, there was still time to head towards the land. When there was still no sign of Snyder, Trotter or Fraser at dawn, the Evelyn K radioed the Coast Guard for assistance. The first Coast Guard planes appeared in less than 2 hours and combed the area for miles in every direction. It seems a little odd to me that they waited until dawn to call the Coast Guard. I'm not really sure what to make of that. But then again, I've never been in a situation like this. Perhaps they thought that they would have made it back towards the beach and got to safety. When it got dark and the waves started to get bigger, did they try to make it back to the yacht and got overturned? I haven't stated it outright yet, but needless to say that these 3 men vanished at that time that everyone was engulfed by the darkness and were never seen again. But that wasn't the end of the story. A tremendous search was to be launched today by the Coast Guard. The small boat in which Snyder, Trotter and Don Fraser vanished 9 days ago was discovered by Gus and Rayford Ruiz, Everglade fishermen. Upon discovery, it was noted that the motor and oars were missing, but the oar locks were still in position and appeared to have been used recently. Gus said that the ropes had been tied together across the boat, as if to suggest that someone may have tied himself to the craft in an effort to have been kept from washing overboard. The hope was that the trio could have been swept out to one of the keys, and from there could have tried to make it back to civilization for help. Then came evidence that this might have been the case. Tiny island to be seen of new hunt. 3 footprints were found Sunday on the beach of a tiny island at the mouth of Lost Man's River, about 20 miles southeast of Everglade City, and bloodhounds were to be put on the trail today in the hope it might lead to Albert Snyder. Sheriff Thord said the tracks were discovered on the beach of the island by one of the searching flyers who landed his seaplane there. Lost Man's River is a fitting name here, and actually received it as a result of some local folklore in which a group of men while exploring the area became lost, vanished and were never found. I couldn't find too much about that, but it's interesting nonetheless. In any case, after the footprints were analysed, it was realised that they were roughly the same size as Al. So, a detective from Miami, Thomas Leip, set out for this island, and with him came one of his best bloodhounds. Don Fraser Jr. drove Thomas and the dog down to Everglade City, where they were then flown to the island. The sheriff was hopeful that this was Al, and reasoned that it's unlikely people would find themselves there without being involved in an accident like this. He also reasoned that if this in fact was them, they couldn't have gotten very far. The idea was that they may have beached this skiff at this island at Lost Man's River before it was then just taken away and crashed into the rocks further up near Everglade Sea. The reason they thought this could have been the case was firstly, the men did have an understanding of safety and what they needed to do in rough weather like that, and secondly, the skiff was in decent condition all things considered. Detective Leip and his dog made no new ground when they reached the island, and the bloodhound, despite being taken to the footprints, just couldn't find a scent to latch onto. As a result of this, more helicopters were flown in, carrying packs of bloodhounds and their handlers. Further tracks were found, and this time, Leip's dog did actually follow them for a while, but they petered out into nothing, and that was the final clue. There's no solid evidence to suggest that it was Al's footprints. Ultimately, the search would come to a close 2 weeks after they vanished, and nothing else was ever found. So, now let's turn our attention to the final disappearance. Let's talk about Jonathan Miles Robinson, a 23-year-old British graduate who disappeared during a family Christmas holiday in Switzerland at the famous ski resort of Wengen. Miles was a highly intelligent individual and had graduated from Newcastle University studying maths and economics. This place in Switzerland wasn't new to him, and travelling to the ski resort at Wengen was an annual trip he and his family took, along with some friends. The Robinson family had been staying at the Eiger Hotel and arrived on the 20th of December. The event of the disappearance itself unfolded just 2 days later, with Miles last being seen in the early hours of the 22nd of December after a night out with his friends. On the 21st, Miles had been skiing for most of the day and went for a family dinner in the early evening. Once finished, he and his sister went over to the Crystal Bar, and then later on he joined his family and other friends in heading over to the Blue Monkey Bar, where they planned to spend the rest of the night socialising. The group were having a good time, and this went on until 2 AM, where Miles and the others had enough and decided to all walk back to their respective hotels. Not wanting one of his friends, Amy, to have to walk back to her hotel alone, he offered to walk her back. CCTV captured them leaving the bar at around 2:20 AM, and then Miles leaving the hotel alone at 2:50 AM, as they had talked for a while before he left. The distance he then had to walk to his hotel was just 200 yards, but he would never make it back for reasons that are completely unknown. At 2:50 AM though, everyone was already asleep and nobody could have known that anything was wrong. Upon awaking that morning, Miles' direct family, his parents and sister, were surprised that he hadn't returned to the hotel. They tried to reach him via the phone, but there seemed to be no signal on Miles' end. The family then put out feelers with his friends to see if he'd stayed over. When that came back negative, they got a little more desperate and called local hospitals to see if there might have been an accident, but that was also a negative. Then, at 11:30 that morning, they called the authorities and investigators arrived at Wengen at 2:15 p.m. The entire group of family and friends were questioned by detectives. Then they decided an official search and rescue operation needed to be undertaken ASAP. So, they had a helicopter above the snowy mountain fitted with thermal imaging cameras while a search dog was being brought in from Bern, the capital. Nothing at all was found that day, and repeated searches failed in the days to come, which led to detectives questioning whether or not he was even in the area anymore. On Boxing Day of that year, police began to look into that possibility, and a couple of things came to light. The only reasonable way to leave Wengen, either up or down, is via the train there, but there was no train in service at 2 a.m. The family were absolutely convinced that foul play must have been involved here, as the whole incident just didn't make any sense. The hotel he had to travel to was only 200 yards away from Amy's, so what in the world happened in those moments? On the 27th, a whole week after he disappeared, the Swiss authorities also must have come to the realization that this was just weird, and they went on a house-to-house search in Wengen, but this also uncovered nothing. On the morning of the 28th, the search was expanded to cover the more perilous parts of the mountain, and a group of 30, including experts familiar with the local geography, undertook a thorough examination of the region without any success. Later that day, additional teams entered the search and ventured into new areas, including the village's outskirts and notably into the Lauterbrunnen Valley. A breakthrough was made when a member of the search team who worked for Swisscom was able to triangulate the last signals from Miles' phone. These signals suggested that the search needed to extend into the lower valley areas. While searching these valleys, a search dog located a scent trail and followed it to a remote lookout point known as Monch Blick. This place was unfamiliar to the family, they didn't know of it and they'd never been there before. In a forested section, at the northern extremity of this valley, these dogs led the searchers to Miles' remains. The terrain in this area was described as treacherous and risky and required a specialised team to navigate as rocks and ice were constantly falling from the mountains above. The body was retrieved and taken to the Bern hospital, and later that day the family would confirm that it was in fact Miles. The injuries were consistent with a significant fall and showed no signs of a struggle or foul play. The authorities stated that they'd flown over this area before but hadn't spotted the body, which I suppose isn't that surprising if it was inside the woods. A densely packed portion would have hidden it quite well from above. The authorities were insistent that a crime had not been committed, stating that there was no evidence at the lookout point, surrounding it or beneath it. However, I found this article in the Telegraph to be quite interesting. Coroner Dr. Paul Knapman recorded an open verdict after hearing foul play could not be ruled out, but concluded that it was most likely an accident. 6 days after disappearing, he was found at the bottom of a 330-foot cliff in Switzerland, missing his shoes and socks. His last known phone call may have been made accidentally by the impact. The only further evidence of his movements came at 3:26 a.m. when his BlackBerry phone was activated and he called the first person in his phone book. The call was cancelled and police now believe that his phone could have been activated by a bang, possibly as he was falling. Something that seems highly noteworthy there is the fact that he was missing his shoes and socks. You could argue that he must have been suffering from hypothermia at some point, but oddly he was still wearing the rest of his clothing. Only his shoes and socks were missing. I don't believe anyone ever came across them in the duration of the search. StrangeOutdoors.com poses some prominent questions. What happened to Miles Robinson at Monch Blick? Why did he walk to the lookout that night? Why did he stray so far from the resort in an area that he hadn't previously visited? On Facebook, a person familiar with this area, Jennifer, wrote, "I can't imagine how we ended up so far from Wengen. I've walked that path in the summer and it took hours. I have also been a frequent visitor to Wengen and would never have considered doing it in the winter, let alone at night. It makes no sense." Was Miles taken or forced to run for his life, where he then succumbed to the terrain and cold? These are questions we'll never know the answer to. I suppose you could argue that taking a person's shoes away would severely limit the person's ability to get away, but that is just total speculation. In any case, that's about the end of the paper trail. What do you think? With that, I'd just like to take the time to thank the patrons and you for watching. Please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and do drop me a comment as I read almost all of them. Finally, I'd just like to thank MyHeritage again for partnering with me today. If you're interested in learning more about your roots, remember to click the link in the description below for a free 14-day trial. I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.